The night settled over the wide Texas plains with a kind of silence that could make a person feel either comforted or swallowed whole, depending on what was in their heart. Eliza had never known land to stretch so far, so open, so empty of familiar things. The barn was the only place she had seen that offered shelter, and she clutched her worn satchel closer to her chest as she stood in its doorway. The scent of hay was thick, mingling with the faint musk of horses. Wah-ha. To her, it wasn't unpleasant. It was grounding, raw, real, so different from the perfumed air of the parlor room she had been forced to endure before life carried her here. She thought she might sleep right there in the loft, curled up under the dusty rafters, unseen, untouched, unbothered. But then she heard boots against the dirt, heavy, steady, not hurried like a city man, but sure and deliberate. She turned, and there he was, the cowboy she had noticed earlier, the one who had barely spoken more than a few words at dinner, yet seemed to command the space around him, as if silence itself obeyed. His eyes were darker now in the lantern light. A storm gathered inside them, and when he spoke, his voice was like gravel smoothed by rain. "You'll sleep next to me," he said without hesitation, "or not at all." The words struck her harder than a whip crack, not for their roughness but for their finality. She had been told all her life what she could and could not do, yet this was different. This wasn't arrogance, it was protection disguised as command. She opened her mouth to argue, to insist that the barn was fine, safer even, but something about the way he looked at her made her throat tighten. His gaze wasn't hungry like other men's, it wasn't mocking. It was steady, fierce, as if he carried the weight of storms and fire, and still had room to carry her too. She hated that part of her wanted to trust him. She hated even more that her legs trembled as she climbed down from the loft ladder she hadn't yet dared to ascend. He didn't move closer. Not yet. He let her come to him, her pride unraveling with each step. When she was near enough to see the stubble lining his jaw, the scar that cut faintly across his cheek, she realized he was younger than she had assumed, yet older, in ways that had nothing to do with years. He had seen things, hard things. She swallowed, clutching her satchel tighter. "I don't need your bed," she whispered, though her voice betrayed her with a quiver. He tilted his head slightly, studying her like he might a skittish horse, and then he said something that unraveled the last defense she held. "Darling, the wolves don't care where you lay your head. Out here, you either trust someone to watch your back, or you don't wake at all." The barn felt colder suddenly. She thought of wolves, real ones, not just the kind in men's hearts, and she pictured herself alone, shivering under the weight of shadows. He was right. She knew it, and he knew she knew it. With a sigh that carried more defeat than relief, she followed him toward the small cabin at the edge of the homestead, the lantern in his hand through long shadows, stretching across the dirt path like reaching fingers. She kept her eyes fixed on the glow, willing herself not to look at the sky that seemed too big, too endless, reminding her of how far she was from everything she had ever known. Inside the cabin, the air was warmer, tinged with wood smoke and leather. The single bed was pushed against the far wall, covered with a patchwork quilt that looked handmade, maybe by a mother long gone, or a woman who once waited for him. Eliza stood awkwardly near the door, unsure if she should put her satchel down or keep holding it as if it might shield her from whatever storm she had just walked into. The cowboy set the lantern on the table, then shrugged off his hat, tossing it onto a chair. Without turning, he spoke again. "You'll take the bed." The words startled her, and she shook her head quickly. "No, I couldn't. It's yours." He turned then, his eyes softer now, though his stance remained iron. "You've been running a long way. I can see it in your face. You need rest. I'll take the floor." That broke something in her she hadn't expected. She had prepared herself to resist his dominance, but kindness, she didn't know how to fight that. She wanted to cry, to scream, to collapse all at once, but instead she nodded and finally set her satchel down. He spread out a blanket on the wooden floor with the same quiet efficiency he had shown in everything else, and then he lay down without another word, arms crossed over his chest, as if sleep could come that easily. Eliza stood by the bed, feeling the weight of 1,000 unspoken thoughts pressing against her ribcage. She slid under the quilt, pulling it up to her chin, and stared at the ceiling beams. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The night sounds drifted in through the cracks: crickets, the distant howl of something wild, the creak of wood settling in the cool air. Her heart thudded painfully against her chest, but slowly the rhythm of his breathing from the floor began to calm her. It was steady, unyielding, like the land itself, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt the edges of safety wrap around her. Tomorrow would bring questions, maybe danger, maybe choices she wasn't ready to face. But tonight, for one night at least, she would let herself sleep. The morning came not with a gentle light, but with a blaze of gold across the horizon, flooding the cabin in a way that felt almost intrusive. Eliza stirred first, her eyes blinking open to beams that caught the dust motes dancing in the air. For a moment she forgot where she was, expecting to see the familiar confines of her old room, or the walls of an inn where strangers lingered too close. Instead, she found herself tucked beneath a quilt that smelled faintly of cedar and smoke, and when she shifted, she saw the man on the floor, still asleep, his arm bent beneath his head. In the daylight, he looked younger somehow, less carved by shadow, though the hardness in his jaw remained. His hat was still on the chair, his boots neatly aligned by the wall, small signs of order in a world that felt unpredictable to her. She studied him for longer than she meant to, wondering what kind of man would insist she take his bed, what kind of man would guard a stranger in the night without demanding anything in return. The thought unsettled her as much as it steadied her, for she knew from experience that kindness often came with a hidden price. She rose quietly, careful not to wake him, and stepped outside into the sharp morning air. The land stretched before her in endless rolling waves of grass, dotted with cattle moving slow as the day began. Beyond them, the mountains loomed like ancient watchers, unchanging, unyielding. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and breathed deep, the scent of sagebrush and dust filling her lungs. It was wild, untamed, dangerous even, and yet there was something in it that whispered of freedom. For the first time since she fled the life that had bound her, she felt the faint stirring of possibility. But freedom was fragile, she knew, and it had teeth. The cowboy emerged soon after, his boots crunching softly against the dirt as he came to stand beside her. He said nothing at first, just followed her gaze out toward the horizon, as if he too measured the weight of the world in silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost thoughtful. "This land'll test you, break you if you're not ready, but it'll give back more than it takes if you're willing to fight for it." She turned to look at him, startled by the poetry hidden in his rough words. "And you?" she asked before she could stop herself. "Has it given back to you?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "It's taken more than I had to give, but I'm still here." There was a story behind those words, one he wasn't offering, and she wasn't sure she was ready to hear. Instead, she followed him as he moved toward the corral, where the horses stirred restlessly. He worked with quiet efficiency, his hands strong and sure as he checked the ropes, the gates, the saddles. She watched him, fascinated by the way he seemed a part of the land, rooted in it, shaped by it. When he caught her staring, she flushed and quickly looked away. But he only smirked faintly, as if he were used to people underestimating what they saw. By midday, she had begun to understand that life here was not idle. Every hour demanded something. feeding livestock, hauling water, mending fences. I bet he did it all without complaint, moving from one task to another as though each was as vital as breathing. Eliza tried to help where she could, though her hands were untrained, blistering quickly under the coarse rope and wooden handles. He corrected her gently when she faltered, never mocking, though his eyes held a glint of quiet amusement at her stubbornness. She hated that she wanted his approval, hated that every word from him seemed to chip away at the walls she had so carefully built. It was later, when the sun hung heavy in the sky, that trouble came. She heard it first, the distant thunder of hooves that didn't belong to the ranch herd. The cowboy stiffened instantly, his eyes narrowing toward the ridge. Within minutes, 2 riders appeared, their horses kicking up dust as they descended fast. Eliza's breath caught in her throat, and instinctively she stepped closer to him. He didn't acknowledge the movement, but his hand brushed lightly against hers, steadying her before he strode forward to meet them. The men were rough, their clothes dust-stained, their faces shadowed beneath wide-brimmed hats. One of them spat to the side before speaking. "You're late with payment, Cole. Land like this don't stay yours unless you keep up." Cole. The name suited him, sharp and strong. He stood tall, his stance unshaken. "I've never been late a day in my life," he said evenly. "And I won't start now. You tell your boss he'll get what's owed, same as always." The man sneered, eyes flicking toward Eliza. Funny. Seems like you've found yourself a distraction. City girl, ain't she? Pretty thing. Shame if trouble found her." The implication curled through the air like smoke, and Eliza's stomach knotted. But Cole didn't flinch. He stepped slightly in front of her, his voice dropping to a steel edge. "She's under my roof. That makes her mine to protect. You so much as breathe wrong in her direction, you won't leave this land standing." For a long, tense moment, the men stared at him, measuring the weight of his words. Then one of them chuckled darkly. A careful cowboy. Wolves travel in packs. With that, they turned their horses and rode off, leaving dust and unease in their wake. Eliza realized she had been holding her breath, and when she exhaled, her hands trembled. Cole glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "You see now why you couldn't stay in the barn?" he said quietly. "Out here, being alone is the same as being hunted." The rest of the day passed in a blur, though the threat lingered in her mind like a shadow that wouldn't lift. That night, back in the cabin, she sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the flames in the small stove, while Cole moved about with his usual quiet strength. Finally, unable to keep the words in, she asked, "Why did you protect me like that? You don't even know me." He paused, then leaned against the wall, his eyes fixed on her with a depth that made her heart pound. "And maybe I don't need to know your whole story to see you're worth protecting. Some things you just know." Her throat tightened, emotions clawing at her. She wanted to tell him everything. Why she had run, what she had left behind, the dangers that might still be chasing her, but the words stuck. Instead, she nodded, and for the first time in years, she felt a thread of hope weaving its way through her fear.